Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a new series which I call Great Recordings You've Probably Never Heard of. And the reason I'm doing this series is because, well, there are lots of reasons, of course, but because we're interested in finding the best recordings of everything. But this particular series of videos is dedicated to less familiar repertoire, often performed by less well-known artists. Now, if you're a hardcore classical music collector, I can tell you straight off, this series may not be for you. I am constantly looking at the comments and things I get, and one of the things that I always find striking is that this is classical music. Most people don't know anything about it, number one. And number two, there are people who are just getting into it and who are at every level of introduction to this kind of music, to the medium. And they have every level of knowledge. And the vast majority of people do not have 100,000 CD collections or streaming whatevers. And they don't know who these artists are, especially younger listeners. I often say to my colleagues in the business, we oldsters or older sters, if that's what we are, just how lucky we were, because we were around in the 60s and 70s and 80s when the classical music industry just exploded with recordings and with the discovery of new repertoire from all periods. And we were there to absorb it all and to take it all in. But people who have begun in the past 20 years or so, maybe even 30 years, I mean, you're turned loose on this jungle of material that's completely disorganized. And, the only people who get promoted are the top media icon type artists. And that means that some of the very best recordings don't get talked about and don't get mentioned, and they're going to be unfamiliar to the majority of people. So I don't want, the hardcore snooty ones coming out and saying, "Oh, I know that recording. Everybody knows that recording." We can't assume. We have to try and keep ourselves a little bit humble here and remember that for the vast majority of humanity, all of this is terra incognita. And in making it more cognita, we just have to take things one step at a time. And so this series is devoted to great recordings of music that's really digestible and interesting and immediately appealing, but that which most people may not know, either because the artists are unfamiliar or the work is unfamiliar. And so it's going to be a very select, curated collection. I don't know how many videos we'll do. Usually I stop at a few hundred, but we're going to get started and we're going to see how it goes. And we'll see how, and those of you who are hardcore collectors, you can play your own knowledge off against mine and have a good time. But please, when it comes to the comments and things, be aware. Be aware that not everybody knows what you know, and not everybody wants to know what you know. And the idea is to be encouraging, to be forthcoming, to try and explain to people why these recordings are marvelous and why it makes sense to give them a shot. Especially now that with streaming, you can find just about anything in the universe and listen to it at your leisure. So our very first entry is an extraordinarily interesting work. It is the Brahms Piano Quartet No. 1, orchestrated by Arnold Schoenberg, the fearsome inventor of 12-tone, 8-tonality type stuff. Now, Schoenberg was really quite a character, and he did quite a bit of orchestrating. Arrangements of works by other composers, which somehow managed to come out sounding just as quirky and somewhat irascible as he supposedly was himself. Now, the Brahms Piano Quartet is a gorgeous work with a zippy Hungarian finale. And, if you want to listen to the Brahms Hungarian Quartet No. 1, Hungarian Quartet is Hungarian finale, the Brahms Piano Quartet No. 1, by all means, please do, because the comparison between the original and what Schoenberg does to it is really kind of amazing. Because Brahms, as some of you may or may not know, was noted as a conservative composer, someone who was writing in the tradition of Mozart and Beethoven, and who believed in the classical ideals of the symphony and the concerto as expressed by those composers. And so his handling of the orchestra, even for that period, was considered to be somewhat austere compared to what was going on by people like Wagner and all these other, sort of flashy theatrical composers. So the piano quartet is written for piano and three strings, a violin, a viola, and a cello. And it's about 45 minutes long. I mean, it's a symphony in its length. It's a big, heavy-duty chamber piece. Schoenberg felt that it was usually given mediocre performances at best, and so he thought he was going to fix that by arranging it for a full symphony orchestra and realizing its potential. Now, Schoenberg claimed that what he was doing was in the style, or at least in the the aesthetic, let's put it that way, of Brahms himself. But boy, oh boy, if you know your Brahms symphonies and you enjoy them, and then you listen to this sucker, it's a whole other world, especially in its handling of a percussion section, which Brahms never would have dreamed of touching. I mean, you've got tambourines and xylophones and glockenspiels and celestas and all these nutty instruments that Brahms never touched, some of which he wouldn't have even known existed, and certainly wouldn't have put into a symphonic composition if he knew that they existed. It's a very modern vision of the work, but at the same time, it's a wonderful realization of the latent potential, what you might call, of this relatively austere chamber work, because especially the finale, which is a Hungarian dance finale, Schoenberg just lets it rip with everything that he can. And his technique in handling the other instruments is equally advanced. He uses brass flutter tonguing, where you go, raspberries, you make tremolo sounds on the brass, and it's got all kinds of wild things going on. And it's very beautiful. And it's in its way, because of its incredible seriousness and refinement of technique, which is something Schoenberg was always very serious. It really is faithful to the spirit of Brahms, if not to the letter. So what is the great recording of this work? Well, it's been recorded a lot in recent decades, because people are always looking for new pieces to play by composers who are familiar. And the idea that there was this juicy orchestration of this big chamber work by Brahms was like, everyone realized, like, oh, wow, it's like having another Brahms symphony. Let's record it. And that happened. But way back when, it got an amazing recording, the first major recording of the arrangement by Robert Kraft. Robert Kraft was Stravinsky's assistant and follower, and he was a big proponent of works by composers of the Second Viennese School, Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern, particularly Schoenberg and Webern. And he recorded this work with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He later remade it for the Naxos label, but originally it was on Columbia, CBS, with the Chicago Symphony, the enormously great Chicago Symphony in 1966. The orchestra was then, one of the greatest. It still is one of the greatest in the world, of course, but then it was really, really firing on all cylinders. It had just lost its conductor, legendary conductor Fritz Reiner. Jean Martinon had taken over. He wasn't actually getting along terribly well with the orchestra, but the orchestra was still fabulous, absolutely fabulous. And Robert Kraft was not known as a conductor. He was known as a conductor of avant-garde 20th century music, which meant that this recording was never going to get a tremendous amount of attention. But it is so exciting. In many ways, it's still the most exciting of all the versions that have been done since. And like I said, there have been really probably a couple dozen that have come out since this one did. But this is unquestionably a great recording. It has that feeling of discovery, this youthful passion and energy. And for Brahms, this is a youthful work too, by the way. And it's just dynamite, absolutely dynamite. And if you want to hear what Brahms might have sounded like if he'd been a 20th century composer, if you want to hear one of Brahms's greatest chamber works, but you're not like a chamber music person, this is a fabulous, fabulous way to get to know the piece. One of the biggest problems with unusual repertoire is that people do it because it's unusual. But the biggest artists and the biggest labels often don't promote unusual repertoire because they won't take the financial risk. They know they're not going to sell a lot. They know that most listeners don't know it, and so they're not going to be that interested. They don't know how to market the stuff, so people aren't going to find it on their own. And that's really, the one of the other reasons behind this series, because people, works that are lesser known may be great. They may be absolutely as great as the greatest of masterpieces that are out there, but they need to be performed like they're great. You need to have great recordings of them. It's nice that you can hear unusual music by unusual composers performed by, provincial orchestras and people you've never heard of. But if the performance is just a make-weight, something that just sort of gets it out there so you know that it exists, but it's not fabulous, it doesn't do the music justice. And there's less of a chance that it's going to catch on or become popular, or that people who are, less familiar are going to purchase it and enjoy it or give it a chance. So that's why I'm doing these. And I think this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. It's a major work. It's a major work by Brahms. It's a major project by Schoenberg. An absolutely delightful landmark in the history of Brahms' reception and Brahms' presentation to the public at large. It's by a conductor who, to the extent people know about him, people probably don't like 90% of the music he recorded. It's on a major label, Columbia, which kept it out of print forever and treated it rather badly, but it's reissued it a couple times now. It was in the Great Recordings series as a single disc, along with other Schoenberg arrangements of Bach's music, which were marvelous. And it's in this is the one from the complete Robert Kraft box, which I'm not recommending that you all buy if you're just beginning or you're just starting. That's a huge box of difficult music. It's a wonderful box of difficult music by a major guy. I love it, but we're talking about this work, this performance. So it's the Schoenberg Piano Quartet in G minor, which is its opus. I can't even see. We have tiny type piano quartet in G minor, opus 25. There it is, if you're curious. And as arranged by Schoenberg, it's a marvel. And this is an extraordinarily exciting performance that belongs in the collection of all curious classical music listeners and potential collectors. Don't think you just have to do the regular things. Try and see, what's out there, and experiment and see what catches your fancy, and start with the finale. I'm telling you right now, listen to the last movement first, then go back and do the whole thing, and you'll see how it all cranks out, because it gets more fantastical as it goes, and that's part of the fun. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.